June 2025, the shadows burned away. After decades of sabotage, secrets, and proxy strikes, Israel launched a full-scale daylight assault on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Iran responded with its largest missile barrage in history, and for the first time in this long conflict, nothing was hidden. Stock markets trembled, oil prices jumped, satellites tracked the missiles in real time, and both sides invoked prophecy to justify what followed. This wasn't just escalation, it was a threshold moment. The transition from war by denial to war by declaration. Initiate the research.
You sent us quite a stack of sources, articles, analyses, real-time reports, all zeroing in on a moment that really, really shook things up. That June 2025 escalation between Israel and Iran.
Right.
So our mission here is to, cut through the noise and all this material, pull out the core insights.
Exactly. Think of it like getting to the heart of what actually happened, understanding the economic fallout, the diplomatic ripples, the military back and forth itself, and, well, the strategic picture left behind.
Yeah, because what happened on June 13th and 14th, it wasn't just another headline, was it?
No, not at all.
It felt like the moment this long-running shadow war, the covert stuff, proxies, cyber attacks just burst out into the open, full-on military confrontation.
Stepped right into the light.
So we're going to explore how Israel launched this strike described as unprecedented, what Iran's counterstrike actually hit, how markets, went haywire globally, and what it all means going forward. You should expect some details from these sources, things about like covert operations you probably didn't hear much about, and vulnerabilities that suddenly became very clear.
Yeah, and probably the best place to start is that initial Israeli action. Operation Rising Lion.
Let's do it. So June 13th, 2025, years of tension, covert stuff, and then bang, open warfare. Israel launches this massive attack.
Operation Rising Lion, yeah.
Yeah.
And when the sources say massive, they really mean it. We're talking initial reports suggesting over 200 Israeli Air Force planes in just the first wave.
200, wow.
Yeah, delivering more than 330 precision munitions. They hit something like 100 targets across Iran. And the Israeli officials were very clear, framing it as preemptive, aimed at what they saw as an imminent nuclear threat.
But this wasn't just like a standard air raid, was it? The sources seemed to stress the collaboration.
Oh, definitely. Highly integrated. IDF and Mossad working hand in glove, apparently the culmination of years of planning. But what really makes this strike stand out, looking at the materials, is the tactics.
Tell me about those. What did the sources reveal?
Well, beyond the heavy use of F-35I stealth jets, the Adir, the element in many sources is Mossad's role inside Iran.
Inside Iran itself. How did that work with the air attack?
So according to multiple reports, Mossad had assets, capabilities pre-positioned within Iranian territory.
Yeah.
Including, and this is what some described as remote activated strike platforms.
Wait, like drones or charges hidden near targets?
Potentially, yeah. Hidden near critical spots, like Iran's long-range missile launchers aimed at Israel.
So while the jets are flying in, things are getting hit from the ground up almost.
Exactly. It sounds like a highly coordinated sequence. The sources suggest that at the very moment the main air attack kicked off, these internal assets were activated.
Wow.
And it wasn't just hitting missile launchers. Mossad teams also reportedly carried out sabotage on Iran's air defense's radar sites, anti-aircraft batteries disabling them right as the Israeli jets were coming in.
That's incredible. It basically blinded Iran's defenses just when they needed them most.
That seems to be the assessment, yes. This mix of stealth aircraft and simultaneous internal sabotage gave the Israeli jets, well, unprecedented air supremacy over Iran. Let them get in deep, hit targets with less resistance than may be expected. It sort of rewrote the playbook for a preemptive strike, according to these analyses.
And Israel was very careful, wasn't it, to say they did this alone, no foreign bases used?
Yes, they insisted on that,
Well,
acted unilaterally, which implies a heavy reliance on in-flight refueling, given the distances.
right.
Now, while neighbors like Azerbaijan or the Gulf states denied helping or allowing transit, some reports did hint at maybe some tacit cooperation airspace use. But regardless, just the fact of Israeli jets operating so widely over Iran, hitting targets from Tehran down to Isfahan, that itself was completely unprecedented.
So Operation Rising Lion, massive high-tech covert support, preemptive. What exactly did they hit? What were the key targets inside Iran?
The target list was clearly strategic,
Yeah.
laid out in detail across the sources, and heavily focused on Iran's most sensitive capabilities.
Nuclear facilities would be top of that list, I think.
Natanz was a primary target. But the strategy there, according to these analyses, wasn't necessarily about blowing up the deep underground halls right away. It was about disabling them, cutting their lifelines.
Lifelines, you mean power.
Precisely. Reports and satellite imagery confirmed hits on the main outdoor electrical substation, critical backup generators, basically cutting the power to those underground halls.
Oh, okay.
The above-ground pilot fuel enrichment plant was also reportedly destroyed. But the key idea seems to be cut off power and ventilation, and any centrifuges spinning down there would eventually crash if their internal backup power failed, halting enrichment, at least for a while.
And did the IAEA confirm this?
The IAEA,
Yeah.
the UN watchdog, yeah, they later confirmed explosions happened there. Though initially they reported no radiation leak, which is important.
What about Isfahan? What was hit there?
Isfahan was also hit. Facilities near there, including the uranium conversion facility, the UCF, that's crucial for processing raw uranium into the gas they use for enrichment. But what was really notable, based on Israeli claims cited in the sources, was the specific targeting of stockpiles of already enriched uranium, 20% and 60%.
And Israel made a pretty big claim about that, didn't they?
They did. They claimed destroying those specific stockpiles eliminated enough material for potentially up to 15 nuclear weapons.
15, that's a lot.
It's a massive number, and definitely debatable depending on weapon design assumptions, but it signals the scale of what they believed they were neutralizing.
Were other nuclear sites hit?
Yes, Kondab, that's the heavy water reactor near Iraq, was also targeted. Although initial reports didn't show immediate major damage, maybe a different approach there. And Fordo, the really deeply buried site, reportedly got hit too.
But it wasn't just the nuclear program. Sources also talked about targeting Iranian leadership.
Yes, very much so. Part of what analysts called a decapitation strategy. Strikes hit residential areas, bases known to house senior IRGC, that's the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and military leaders, like the Sharak-e-Mahalati area in Tehran.
And specific command centers.
One particularly significant strike reportedly used precision missiles to hit an underground command center in Tehran, right when IRGC Aerospace Force leaders were meeting.
And this resulted in serious losses for Iran's top command.
It did. The sources list several very high-profile figures killed, a major blow to their military command and technical expertise. We're talking the IRGC Commander-in-Chief, Major General Salami, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, Major General Bagheri, Quad Force Commander, Major General Khani.
Wow, the very top.
Yeah, and key people in their missile program, air defense too, like Brigadier General Hajizadeh, head of the IRGC Aerospace Force. And it wasn't just military sources also reported nuclear scientists were targeted. Iran acknowledged 6 killed. Israel later claimed 9, including well-known names like Basi Davani.
So a comprehensive attack. Nuclear infrastructure, military bases across the country. You mentioned Tabriz Air Base being basically dismantled and this major hit on leadership.
That's the picture you get reading across the sources, yeah. Israeli officials claimed high precision achieved their main goals, especially degrading Iran's ability to hit back effectively by taking out or sabotaging many missile launchers in that first wave.
But Iran did hit back.
Yeah.
And quickly, Operation True Promise III.
Swiftly, yes. Framed as a direct response. Maybe proportionate in their view. They launched waves of ballistic missiles and these Shahed attack drones. The tactics seemed to be about overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers.
What kind of numbers are we talking about for that counterstrike?
Well, Iranian state media claimed hundreds of ballistic missiles. But the IDF assessment, cited in the sources, was more conservative. They suggested fewer than 100 ballistic missiles, surface to surface, and maybe 2 main barrages.
Still a lot.
Oh, and alongside those, about 100 Shahed attack drones.
And where did these come from? Mainly inside Iran.
Primarily, yes. Reports pointed to launches from IRGC bases in western provinces, like Kermanshah, Khuzestan. But there was also proxy involvement. Houthi forces in Yemen fired at least 1 long-range ballistic missile toward Israel.
And these missiles and drones flew over neighboring countries.
They did. Transited airspace over Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, which was actually because it triggered alerts and significantly interceptions before they even got to Israel.
What were the main target zones inside Israel itself?
The Tel Aviv area, Gush Dan, and Jerusalem, those were identified as the primary targets. Sirens went off across major cities, big alert.
And where did the impacts actually land? Any hits?
Yes, according to the sources, the impacts that occurred in Israel were mainly in residential areas in central Israel. Specifically named were Rishon LeZion and Ramat Gan. cause structural damage, fires.
Residential areas, that contrasts with Iran's claims of targeting military bases.
It does suggest either, well, inaccuracy, or maybe a broader targeting that didn't distinguish much between military and civilian areas. And that Houthi missile from Yemen, it landed short, actually, in the West Bank, near Hebron, injured Palestinian civilians there.
So Iran throws this barrage at Israel. How did Israel's famous multi-layered air defense hold up? Arrow, David's Sling, Iron Dome.
It was definitely put to the test. The whole system, Arrow, which handled the long-range ballistic missiles, was particularly busy, heavily engaged.
And they had help, right, from allies in the region.
Yes, that was critical. U.S. forces in the region provided essential support, helped intercept some Iranian missiles before they reached Israeli airspace.
So what was the overall success rate? How many got through?
Israeli sources claimed a very high rate, well above 80%, maybe even over 90% interception for the ballistic missiles, which is obviously key in preventing a catastrophe.
90%? Wow.
Yeah, the IDF said most intercepted or fell short, and the drone swarm. Sources indicate that was largely intercepted before reaching Israel. Many shot down over Jordan or Saudi Arabia by their air defenses, the rest by Israeli forces closer in.
But even 80-90% isn't 100%. It wasn't perfect. Some got through.
That's the reality the sources highlight. The defense wasn't impermeable. A small number of leakers, as they're sometimes called, did penetrate the layers. And those few impacts caused the damage and casualties reported in Rishon LeZion and Ramat Gan.
Let's talk about the human cost then. What were the casualties reported in Israel from those hits?
In Israel itself, the sources report 3 civilians killed and over 150 wounded, primarily in that Tel Aviv area from those impacts in residential neighborhoods.
Civilians killed.
Yes. Notably, no Israeli military personnel were reported killed.
And the Houthi missile in the West Bank.
That injured 5 Palestinian civilians near Hebron.
If you compare those casualty numbers in Israel to the reported Iranian casualties from Israel's first strike, 78 killed, 320 wounded, it's a stark difference.
It really is. It underscores the dramatically different outcomes, largely down to Israel's robust civil defense, widespread sheltering, and that high interception rate.
Yeah.
Those factors were critical in preventing, a mass casualty event despite the scale of Iran's attack.
Still, even with that defensive success, these attacks must have exposed some vulnerabilities in Israel's security posture. What did the analyses point to?
Several things were highlighted. Yeah, one is just the challenge of handling these mass salvo attacks. Dozens of missiles, drones coming in waves, potentially from different directions. It tests the capacity, the coordination of the whole system.
And raises questions about having enough interceptors.
Exactly. Firing off lots of expensive interceptors against a potentially cheaper barrage that raises concerns about stockpile depth if attacks were sustained or more frequent. And while most were stopped, the fact that even a few got through to dense urban areas confirmed the system isn't hermetic. You just can't guarantee 100% against a big coordinated attack. Even one missile getting through has consequences.
The reliance on partners was also a key point.
Yes. Many drones and missiles were stopped outside Israeli territory by U.S., Jordanian, or Saudi assets. That dependence highlights areas where Israel's own defense umbrella might be weaker or non-existent beyond its immediate borders, needing that allied support.
And the West Bank incident showed a potential gap, too.
It did seem to. The Houthi missile landing in Hebron suggested maybe coverage isn't uniform outside the pre-1967 lines. And there's also the hazard of falling interceptor debris, which needs planning.
Plus the psychological impact, right? Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, directly targeted.
That challenges a core sense of security in Israel's heartland. And despite Israel's big preemptive strike, they couldn't stop all the launches, which analysts suggested might point to intelligence gaps, maybe about mobile launchers or exact timing. Israel did hit some launch sites afterwards, but the initial barrages still happened.
So a strong defense saved lives, definitely, but not foolproof. And the attack exposed real questions about capacity, coverage, reliance on allies.
That's a fair summary of the defense analysis in the material, yes.
Let's zoom out from the military details to the global ripple effects. How did this hit financial markets and shipping instantly?
Oh, almost instantly. Significant shockwaves. The most immediate reaction was energy markets. June 13th, crude oil futures just spiked. Brent jumped over 9%, WTI over 7%.
Just fear of supply disruption. Strait of Hormuz.
Overwhelmingly, that's the choke point everyone worries about, right? About a third of seaborne oil goes through there.
Yeah.
Analysts immediately started warning a serious disruption could push oil into the 80s, 90s, to even over $100 a barrel. Yeah. That risk got priced in very quickly.
And stock markets followed suit, downwards.
They did. Broad sell-off across major indices.
Yeah.
June 13th, the Dow plunged, S&P 500 and NASDAQ fell sharply too, wiped out recent gains. Reports said geopolitical concerns weighed heavily. Europe, Asia followed in the next trading sessions.
Which leads to the classic flight to safety.
Exactly. Investors dumped riskier stuff, ran to traditional safe havens. Gold saw a noticeable jump, up maybe 1.3 or 1.5%, hitting multi-month highs. The US dollar strengthened. High-quality government bonds saw more demand too. Analysts talked about a massive capital flight from risk assets.
And inside the Middle East itself, the financial stress must have been even worse.
Oh, massively so.
Yeah.
Israel's currency, the shekel, tumbled. The cost to insure sovereign debt, those credit default swaps, spiked for Israel and some neighbors. Insurance against default got much more expensive, fast. Major Gulf stock markets also dropped sharply. Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia all saw significant falls.
And money started leaving the region.
Sources reported a flood of capital leaving emerging markets, especially the Gulf. Banking sources mentioned accelerated capital flight. Foreign investors reduced exposure. Wealthy locals moved funds offshore just in case things escalated further.
And what about global shipping, especially near those hotspots? Major alarms.
Huge alarms. Maritime authorities, marine insurers immediately issued warnings for ships in the Persian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, Strait of Hormuz. The big tangible impact everyone expected was soaring war risk insurance premiums.
How much could they jump?
Well, before this, maybe they were around 0.05%, 0.07% of a ship's value per trip. Sources suggested sustained conflict could easily make that jump tenfold, maybe more.
Did that happen right away? The jump?
Markets reacted a bit cautiously at first, but confidence was described as extremely fragile. Insurers were definitely reviewing terms, tightening coverage, and crucially, ship owners started seriously thinking about rerouting, taking the much longer trip around Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, just to avoid the risk despite the cost. War risk surcharges started getting added to cargo fees for Gulf ports almost immediately. That threat to shipping lanes was a huge economic overhang.
So immediate chaos in oil, global stocks down, capital fleeing the region, shipping risks through the roof. It really shows how interconnected everything is. A regional spark instantly causes global financial pain.
That's a key takeaway from the economic data. The perceived distance just vanished.
Let's pivot now to the diplomatic arena. How did the world react politically? The UN Security Council must have been busy.
Very busy. They convened an emergency session right away, June 13th. But the debate, well, it starkly highlighted the deep geopolitical divides over this.
How did the big players line up based on the sources? Trying to report this impartially, of course.
So impartially from the sources. China and Russia strongly condemned Israel's initial strike. Called it a violation of sovereignty, international law. They urged Israel to stop immediately, opposed conflict expansion, and blamed what they called Western anti-Iran hysteria. Both offered to mediate and signaled they'd veto resolutions condemning Iran's response or punishing Tehran.
And the U.S. and Western allies.
They defended Israel's actions, framed it as legitimate self-defense against an existential threat, pointing to Iran's proxies, its nuclear work. While they did support calls for de-escalation, critically, they vetoed language that explicitly condemned Israel's first strike or pushed for a ceasefire that, in their view, left Iran's nuclear capability intact. The U.S. made it clear they'd block attempts to paint Israel as the main aggressor at the Council.
Which means deadlock.
Precisely. The fundamental clash between the veto powers prevented any unified resolution or statement early on. But despite that deadlock, you heard widespread calls for a ceasefire, for restraint from lots of other countries, the UN Secretary General, non-aligned members like the UAE, Brazil, Ghana.
What about other Western reactions, outside the UN specifically?
Key European powers, UK, Germany, France, they walked a fine line. Strong support for Israel's security, but also urgent calls for restraint, for diplomacy. The EU as a whole voiced alarm, called for maximum restraint. The EU High Representative got involved in shuttle diplomacy. And the G7 quickly put the conflict on its agenda. Early statements reportedly showing unity and calling for Iran to stop hostilities and for steps towards calm, often linking it back to needing talks on Iran's nuclear program.
Okay, let's zoom right into the region itself. How did Israel's neighbors, other Middle East powers, react militarily and diplomatically?
You saw this real mix, heightened military alert everywhere, but also this very strong shared desire not to get dragged into a direct Israel-Iran war on their soil.
What about Lebanon and Syria? Close ties to Iran there.
Lebanon's official reaction was quite cautious. Beirut airport reopened quickly after a brief closure, signaling they didn't want the conflict paralyzing their country. Hezbollah condemned Israel, but reportedly showed some initial restraint in its actions, maybe due to prior losses and clashes with Israel, according to some analyses. Syria, still focused inward, condemned Israel but didn't get involved militarily.
Jordan and Iraq must have been in tough spots.
Very tough. Jordan, bordering Israel and Syria, went into intense diplomatic mode, pushing for de-escalation, military on high alert against spillover. Iraq was caught between U.S. troops and pro-Iran militias. Baghdad officially criticized Israel but really prioritized protecting Iraqi territory. They publicly urged militias not to provoke U.S. or Israeli retaliation inside Iraq, and apparently acted as a quiet go-between for the U.S. and Iran.
And the Gulf states, they must have dreaded this.
Dreaded it. Their reaction was all about preventing spread. Public statements from the GCC, Qatar, Oman all urged maximum restraint. Militarily, they went on high alert, activated air defenses, raised readiness at U.S. bases on their soil. In fact, U.S. Patriot and Fraud missile defense systems in the Gulf reportedly helped intercept some of those Iranian missiles heading to Israel. They coordinated emergency plans too. But fundamentally, the sources stress their motivation. They have no appetite for a regional war and didn't want to be forced to choose sides. Their whole economic model depends on stability.
So alongside the public statements, lots of quiet diplomacy, back channels.
The U.S., while publicly saying it didn't greenlight Israel's strike, privately used channels like Switzerland and Oman to message Iran. Reportedly stressed Washington didn't sanction the initial strike and urged Iranian restraint, warning them not to hit U.S. assets or Gulf partners. Oman and Qatar were key intermediaries, using their ties to both sides, trying to float de-escalation ideas. Turkey and Iraq also offered mediation.
So the regional picture, high alert defensively, but urgent, multi-pronged diplomacy trying desperately to contain the crisis.
That's the strong consensus from the material on regional reactions, yes.
Okay, let's circle back to Israel. After that initial strike, Operation Rising Lion, the messaging from Jerusalem seemed to signal more than just a one-off response. It felt like they were articulating a new strategic doctrine.
It definitely did. The messaging afterwards was very deliberate, very pointed, aimed at signaling a real shift in policy on existential threats. Prime Minister Netanyahu explicitly framed it as preemptive self-defense against an existential threat, using that mantra, never again is now.
So what does this new doctrine actually mean based on the sources? What's the shift?
It signals Israel is prepared to strike first overtly, decisively, against what it sees as existential threats, Iran's nuclear program being the prime example, when they judge a point of no return is near. It suggests a move away from waiting until a capability is fully ready or an attack is already underway towards preempting the development of that capability.
It sounds kind of like an update to the old Begin doctrine.
Very much presented that way. The original Begin doctrine was about stopping hostile states getting nukes. But the 2025 version, as described in the sources, seems new in its potential scope, its openness, and the range of targets. Not just nuclear sites, but command structures, delivery systems, leadership, maybe even scientists, as we discussed. It's a broader definition of the existential threat that warrants preemption.
And what are the specific red lines they seem to be drawing now?
The main one, clearly stated, is Iran must never get a deployable nuclear weapon. That includes key steps like enriching uranium to weapons grade or building new hidden enrichment sites. Some analysts also suggested maybe a massive buildup of enemy forces or proxies, if it reached an existential level, could trigger this doctrine too.
So the core message from Israel, based on these sources, is we're willing to launch unilateral, large-scale military action to preempt these threats, whatever the risks, even if it risks a bigger war, and maybe even if allies like the U.S. have reservations.
That is precisely the powerful message being projected with this newly articulated doctrine, yes.
So wrapping this up, what the sources clearly show is that June 13th and 14th, 2025 was really the moment that this decades-long shadow war between Israel and Iran just exploded into open, direct military confrontation.
Yeah, we saw fundamental shifts play out in real time. Iran demonstrated it could and would target Israeli cities directly with missile barrages, and Israel showed it could and would carry out these massive, overt preemptive strikes deep inside Iran, hitting the most sensitive targets, leadership included.
And it wasn't contained, was it? Militarily, maybe to some extent, but the shockwaves hit global financial markets immediately, oil, stocks, and it jolted the diplomatic world, showing those deep divisions, even as everyone scrambled to try and de-escalate.
Right, and while thankfully mass casualties in Israel were largely avoided thanks to air defenses, civil defense, the attacks definitely exposed vulnerabilities. For Iran, the Israeli strikes were a significant blow to the nuclear program, military command, maybe even their sense of invulnerability at home.
The whole strategic landscape, for both countries, for the whole region really, seems irrevocably changed after just those 48 hours.
It really does. And it leaves us, and you, with some pretty profound questions to think about. What does this direct, albeit somewhat contained exchange actually tell us about deterrence in the Middle East going forward? Can a limited preemptive strike really roll back a nuclear program without eventually triggering that wider war everyone fears? And what does this kind of overt conflict, cities under fire, leaders targeted, mean for a world already dealing with so much tension and the risk of rapid escalation? Definitely something to ponder until our next.
Israel called it Rising Lion. Iran called it True Promise. And for a moment, the future of the Middle East hung on two names and 1,000 warheads. The damage was real. Generals killed, centrifuges destroyed, systems blinded. But the legacy may be harder to measure. A precedent has been set, one where preemption is policy, and biblical framing shapes strategic doctrine. The war didn't end that day, but the era of restraint did. Series 2 ends not with resolution, but with recognition that the cycle has changed, that the clock is not just ticking, it has already struck.
Please like and subscribe.